giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. And I'm back for you this week. My voice is a little messed up. I was doing some rehearsal for the show I'm performing in this Saturday with the Hopi Blues Band at Phi Dodo Club in Los Angeles, California. Look that up. But yeah, my voice is a little thrashed. So this week, I'm going to talk about labor unions, the history of labor unions, the policies of labor unions, the consequences, some examples in the real world, and I'm just going to lay the case out. I'll just be straight up here. I don't like labor unions. I feel like in the private sector, you should be able to unionize, but from what I understand about labor unions and what I'll explain, they're deeply communist. They don't understand basic economics, and they raise the cost of doing business, and those added costs are passed down to the consumer, and especially when it comes to government unions, it's passed on to the taxpayer. So let's get into labor unions here. Let's talk about the brief history that I was able to find. Unions have origins from as far back as 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. The Hippocratic Oath was rumored to have been created 20 years after his death by students, and not only includes an oath to protect patients, but an oath to keep out outsiders. Unions also have origins in the pre-industrial era of guilds for craftsmen and merchants. So I'm really going to make the case, but essentially unions, the goal of a union is to secure benefits for its workers at the expense of everyone else. It's to collectivize the workers and have them gain at the expense of everyone else, and also to keep outsiders out. So let's talk about some policies of labor unions. Labor unions are designed to protect and enrich insiders at the expense of the business and customers. Labor unions artificially limit the supply of workers through measures like regulation, apprenticeship rules, and price control. Labor unions support the minimum wage, and they do this in order to price out competition, because the higher the minimum wage is, the more discrimination against the less preferred person that you have. So this was especially true in the United States. I'm going to get into that. And it's true in South Africa as well, that the racist white labor unions wanted minimum wage laws and equal pay for equal work laws to price out the blacks, because construction workers were hiring the blacks oftentimes illegally, because the blacks were marketing their services at a lower price. So if the union wants a monopoly on those jobs, they're going to use the coercive power of government, which oftentimes a lot of unions do, to set a wage rate that is more than the less preferred people are worth, so they don't get hired. That's really what price floors do. Price floors create a surplus, and it makes discrimination against less preferred people more palatable, which is why labor unions support minimum wage laws. They'll tell you differently that they care about the poor, so on and so forth, but the poor and the unskilled are deeply hurt by minimum wage laws, because it prices them out the market. If they can't produce the amount of value that the minimum wage is set at, then they just won't get hired, because that's a losing economic proposition. So let's talk about a specific act in 1931. The Davis-Bacon Act was passed in 1931, and it federally mandated that all contractors that work on a government contract job in excess of $2,000 must pay the prevailing union wage. And essentially what that did was it made a minimum wage for union workers. If man, my voice is really messed up. If you weren't charging, well, if you had a government job for $2,000 or more, you had to pay that union wage, and that union wage was typically above the minimum wage. So if you have to pay, I don't know, let's say $30, $40 an hour, if that's what you must pay, if you're forced at the point of a gun to pay that amount of money? Are you going to hire perhaps the less skilled, less preferred person that would be cheaper in a free market? Or are you going to hire the more experienced people? You're going to hire the more experienced people. Why? If you have to spend $40, why would you hire the guys who aren't as good? Especially, I use an analogy when it comes to buying cars. If you have a brand new BMW versus a 10-year-old BMW with like 100,000 miles on it, the only reason why someone would buy the 10-year-old BMW is because the price of that 10-year-old BMW is much lower than the price of a brand new BMW. But if, I don't know, BMW curried political favor with, corrupt politicians and said, we're going to have a BMW law that all BMWs that are purchased must be brand new BMWs. And they must be, and used BMWs must be purchased at the prevailing price of a brand new BMW. That would mean that no one would be able to sell their used BMW, because if you have to pay $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for the new BMW versus having to pay that for a used BMW with thousands of miles on it, who's going to buy the BMW with 1,000 miles on it? So let's also get into this. Government unions are in bed with Democrat politicians as they exchange money and votes for power. That is a very, very corrupt cycle. Teachers unions, they're some of the biggest donors of the Democrat Party. They make money off the taxpayer, literally, mostly doing a horrible job. They give money to the union. They have to pay union dues. Oftentimes, you're forced to join a union. That union uses that money to back political parties, the Democrat Party, to back political candidates that are going to do the union's bidding. That political candidate gets in office. They give the union what they want, and the cycle just keeps going and going and going at the expense of the taxpayer. So unions receive perks like pensions. These people are retiring at 50, 55 years old, and they're living the rest of their life off the expense of the taxpayer. The taxpayers are slaves for these government workers once they retire, because oftentimes they put little to nothing into their pension. So they're literally living off the taxpayer. In places like LA, New York, Chicago, these places have billions of dollars in debt, and it's mostly due to paying these government worker unions. They get ironclad tenure, especially in teaching. Man, I had seen in some of these school districts, you get tenure after teaching for 3 years. And I've seen that to fire a bad teacher from one of these huge government school districts takes a long time, and it takes about $100,000 to fire a bad teacher. And tenure doesn't benefit, good workers for the most part. Tenure usually benefits the worst workers, the most timid workers, the people that will stay in those jobs forever, the people that aren't going to make noise. Those are the ones that get tenure. A monopoly, an example of the government schools, they have a monopoly on the kids. They do an awful job of educating them, and they are fiercely opposed to any kind of school reform, independent schools, so on and so forth, because they don't want to lose their monopoly. They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to lose their cash flow, and they don't want to lose their political clout. And all of this is at the expense of the taxpayer, all of it. Because if you're working a government job, you are paid by taxpayer dollars. So if you're able to enrich yourself and raise the price of your labor far beyond what it'd be in a free market, far beyond what it'd be in the private sector, because you don't bring back the value in which that they're paying you for, they don't face those restraints, because the taxpayers have to pay for it at the point of a gun. So they can raise the wage rates as much as they want. Like someone's asleep at the wheel, someone else is paying for it. And it hurts the economy, it hurts our businesses, and most importantly, it hurts the people, because they're getting a substandard product at a premium price. So let's get some examples of labor unions, okay? Auto workers in Detroit eliminated most of the jobs in Detroit due to killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. They kept agitating for more benefits, higher pay, far beyond what it'd be elsewhere. And because they did that, a lot of jobs got cut. And the very few people that are still there are making a lot of money, and they have a lot of perks. Yes, by raising the cost of labor while keeping the productivity constant, and sometimes because they had all these entitlements, the productivity went down. This arrangement became a losing economic proposition for the car manufacturers. And these Detroit union members make a lot more money than the workers in non-union jobs in the United States, manufacturers for Toyota, Honda, so on and so forth. So let's get some facts about that. The unionized Big Three workers take about 26 to 31 hours to build a car, while their largely non-union Japanese counterparts take about 17 to 22 hours. There it is, man. I mean, even though the Japanese aren't getting paid as much, they don't have that large safety net. They don't have tenure or any of these other benefits that are a deterrent to work, because when people have license to behave badly, more likely than not, they'll behave badly. Let's give another example. The teachers union, the NEA, one of the largest unions in the country, and they're all government school teachers in this union. They are a protector of a horrible government school system. They protect bad teachers. They oppose independent schools. They enrich and empower leftists and constantly agitate for more taxpayer money. You will never, ever, ever hear a government school teacher say, we are properly funded. It doesn't matter if you give them $20,000 a kid, $30,000, $40,000, they'll still come out and say, we need more funding, we're underfunded. It's a big lie. Okay? They're the largest union in the country. The teachers union in Mexico, this is what I found out watching the video. The teachers union in Mexico is the largest union in Latin America and receives such perks as a guaranteed job out of college, an ironclad tenure the first day you start the job. Their protests have often been violent and have often resulted in kidnapping opponents. 52% of American union members work for the government. Over half of the union members work for the government. Even former private sector union bosses have said that it is impossible to collectively bargain with the government because the incentives and the deterrent of operating an actual business in the free market aren't there. If you pay your workers too much money and they don't bring back that value, you're going to go out of business. Your competitors are going to undercut you. You're going to lose in the long run. Okay? But when you're working for the government, you can continue to squeeze and extort the taxpayer because the money's not coming out of your pocket. It's coming out of someone else's pocket. And you never want a third party spending money on another group of people. They will rarely, if ever, spend that money efficiently. Okay? They can give their constituents whatever they want because it doesn't come out of their pocket. It comes out of someone else's pocket. And it keeps going. They enrich themselves at the expense of you. And, a company like Apple or Toyota, they're enriching themselves by creating wealth and giving people what they actually want. They're not making their money through threats, intimidation, and coercion. Let's keep this going. Even FDR, the fascist FDR, said that government unions are antithetical to the purpose of government. Government workers now earn more money than their counterparts in the private sector, and over 80% of government workers have pensions as compared to just 50% of private sector workers. Why? Because if you give these large, generous pensions in the private sector, you're going to go bankrupt. But when you do it for government workers, you can just continue to tell the taxpayer, oh, we're underfunded, we need more help, we need more assistance. And suckers are born every minute. So people fall hook, line, and sinker for that stuff. But it's not true. They get paid more because of what I said. It's not because they produce more value. It's because the incentives and deterrents are out of whack when it comes to working for the government. Instead of that money being made through legitimate means, through through a good use of scarce resources that have alternative uses, due to economizing, due to providing goods and services at affordable prices that people are willing to pay for, the government does the exact opposite of what I said. Let's keep it moving with more examples. The average Chicago government school teacher makes $76,000 a year and spends less time teaching students than the national average. The average school day in Chicago is 5 hours and 45 minutes. The charter schools in Chicago spend more time in the classroom and have a graduation rate of 76%, as opposed to the 56% graduation rate in Chicago government schools. As a surprise to no one, and I can guarantee you that the charter schools spend less money than the government schools. And obviously they achieve better results because of competition. When you have to work for these kids, you have to provide goods and services at affordable prices, or else you get eliminated. They'll go somewhere else. But in the government school system, which is a monopoly, which kids are forced to go to these failing schools at the point of a gun, and all the politicians that support these teachers and these other commies in these government school systems give those people whatever they want. They give them ironclad tenure, pensions, a monopoly. They do this because they can. They do this because who's going to stop them? You know, they keep failing these kids, but you know, as long as people keep voting for them, they oppose the independent schools. So they can continue to say, oh, we're underfunded, and people still give them money, even though it's not true. You can continue to fail the kids and achieve abysmal results, because where else are the kids going to go? They can't go anywhere. They're forced at the point of a gun to go to your failing school, and because of your leftist Democrats that are in office due to you, they oppose any kind of competition. So there you go. More examples. Eva Moskowitz, her Success Academy in New York City, achieves results far beyond their government school competitors. The teachers union, along with leftist groups like the NAACP, tried to shut down their operation. John L. Lewis, the head of the United Mine Workers from 1920 to 1960, has been called the world's greatest oil salesman because his union tactics raised the price of coal, leading consumers to purchase oil. His decision to have fewer workers in the mines with more machinery and capital to work was good for those few workers, but it led to a lot of other workers being out of work and a lot of mining towns being shells of their former selves because those people are out of work. Oh man, Lee Kuan Yew. Let's talk about him, the leader of Singapore. I'm going to do a podcast about him next week. Get this book. He talks about how in order to achieve prosperity and growth in his country, he had to break down the unions. So let's get some quotes from Lee Kuan Yew's book. Quote, "To attract investments, we had to free unions from communist control and educate union leaders and workers on the need to create new jobs by getting investments." Told you, a lot of those unions are filled with communists. They don't understand supply and demand. They don't understand that there are no solutions, there are trade-offs. You don't understand that if you pay them double for the same amount of work, less people are going to be hired, because that's a losing economic proposition to pay all those people double for, and when they're not doubling their productivity. All right, next quote. "Given the communist hold on our unions, it was inevitable that we suffered endless strikes, slowdowns, and riots from the late 40s to the 1960s. Between July 1961 and September 1962, we had 153 strikes, a record for Singapore." Because they're commies. They have no gratitude. They're filled with anger and resentment. They feel like they are entitled to what someone else has because they're breathing. They said, "Oh, we built it. We built this place." No. You're working for that company because they're paying you a wage that obviously is better than anything else that you can get, because if you can get better, you leave. That business has to pay all of those people before making a profit. Literally, they have to pay rent for the building. They have to pay for the electricity. They have to pay for all of you. They have to pay for everyone before they make a profit. And profit is not only an incentive to do business, but it also is a display of a proper allocation of resources that have alternative uses. And once you have more profit, you can invest that into more capital so you can be more productive, so you can pay the workers more, you can produce goods and services at a cheaper price, and you can get more consumers, and you can make your products more affordable and more accessible to others. More quotes from Lee Kuan Yew. To draw non-communist union leaders away from communist influence, these advisors taught them all the bad habits and practices of how to squeeze employers for more pay and benefits regardless of the consequences to the economy. Another quote. I admitted that I had been responsible for many of them. He's talking about the unions. When I was negotiating for them. Or the strikes or whatnot. At the time, there was too much exploitation of our workers, but the consequences were so bad, adding to our unemployment, that I regretted having done this. So Lee Kuan Yew understood early on that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Even though he said they were being exploited, what he achieved afterwards was far worse than what was going on previously. So Lee Kuan Yew, he goes to say in the rest of that chapter that the government workers were getting all these lavish benefits at the expense of the taxpayer, so on and so forth. And he talked to them and said, you know what, you're going to have to roll these benefits back because we can't afford this. This is going to bust the budget. We're going to have to confiscate too much wealth at the point of a gun from people to support your greed. And they said, no way, man. We're going on strike. So what he did is he fired all of them, and he had a contract the next day, and he said, listen, if you want to work for the Singapore government, these are the conditions. Take it or leave it. They took it. If you understand anything about government workers, the turnover rate for workers in the government is much lower than the turnover rate in the private sector, and that is because those government workers cannot get a deal nearly as good in the private sector than the government sector, because one, they're not producing as much wealth, nearly as much wealth as people in the private sector, and also no one would be willing to pay them that amount of money because what they're producing isn't worth. But government doesn't go out of business because they keep the cash flow coming by forcefully confiscating property that doesn't belong to them and give it to someone else who it doesn't belong to. So let's talk about the big myth about labor unions, at least in the United States. The big myth is that labor unions are responsible for the rise in wages for Americans. That is a big lie. The truth is, from the Civil War to 1900, wage rates were steadily rising. As recently as 1900, only 3% of all workers were members of a union. And today, only 11% of American workers are part of a union. And this argument is similar to the minimum wage argument. People, they say, oh, with no minimum wage, everyone would be paid like 10 cents an hour. Even though we have a minimum wage, only a small percentage of jobs actually pay that minimum wage. So if you follow that kind of logic, that employers would pay the least amount of money that they can, why isn't every employer trying to hire people at a minimum wage? The reason is because they pay people based on value and productivity. And prices are a mechanism that guide resources to their most effective uses. Prices incentivize and deter consumption and production. And if you want someone to do a tough job that's going to require years of schooling and it's a productive and valuable skill, you're going to have to pay them a good amount of money or else they're not going to go. And also, if you have competitors who are competing for these same people, then if you want to be cheap, you're not going to get the best workers. And if you don't get the best workers, you're not going to be as productive. And you're not productive, you might go out of business in the long run. So here are my implications. I'm for freedom of association. In the private sector, voters should be able to unionize, but without the coercion of union bosses. If private sector workers want to unionize, it should be with a silent ballot. They did that in the Toyota factories in the United States, but they chose not to unionize because they saw what happened to the job in Detroit. And most people, when they have a decision as to keep their job and to lose their job, they'll keep their job. Okay? Employees and prospective employers should be able to negotiate a wage without the intrusion of third parties like unions and government. I'm all for freedom. They should look at the empirical evidence of what unions accomplish and seriously consider if it's a good move. As for government workers, they shouldn't be able to unionize. The perverse incentives for themselves and their political constituents are too great, and taxpayers pay the price. In big Democrat-run cities all across the country, billions of dollars have been run up in debt due to the pandering to unions, like Detroit. I had a podcast a few weeks ago on Hispanic Detroit. I talked about how labor unions, soft crime laws, a growing entitlement class, and the politics of envy and resentment ruined Detroit. All right. If one is for economic freedom and limited government, I strongly recommend being anti-union for the reasons I prescribe. They are not the reason for prosperity. Oftentimes, they put up insurmountable barriers for poor people and low-skilled people. Their benefits come at the expense of the taxpayer. They're largely communist. They destroy economies and they destroy companies with their Marxist antics. And also, it limits what individuals and individual business people can negotiate for themselves. If I want to work for $10 an hour, I should be able to do that. Government shouldn't tell me I can't work for that little, or the union shouldn't say, hey man, you can't do that, man. The rest of our workers, man, they're getting paid $25 an hour. If you start saying that you'll do it for $10 an hour, what's going to happen to us? Listen, I work for myself, and if I can produce value for myself and my family, and that helps the company, and they can produce more wealth and they can invest, they're going to create more jobs. I think that's good for everyone. Think about it. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe on iTunes. Subscribe on YouTube. Like it. Leave a comment. Tell your friends about it. Donate on Patreon. Get the Lord Gord album, This Isn't TV, on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify. Look up the music video online. Go to postlife.com. You'll find a lot of information there. If you're in LA, come to the Blues Jam every Tuesday night at the Airliner in Lincoln Heights. Free admission. It's a 21 and over club. It's from 9 p.m. to midnight. $1 tacos. It's open mic. You want to bring your instrument, sing, you can do that. Next week, I'm going to talk about my man Lee Kuan Yew. I'm going to talk about how he turned Singapore from a poor island that the British left to one of the most prosperous places in the world. How Singapore now has a higher per capita income than the United States, and how a lot of the values of Singapore are what the values of the United States used to be before we were subverted by fascists and communists. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. Talk to you next time.